What we're going to do now is try to bring together all of the things that we've read from Nietzsche thus far and try to understand where he thinks things, history, might be going. So, from the first essay of the genealogy, we get this distinction between noble morality and slave morality, good versus bad and good versus evil. And we've talked about how slave morality arises as a reaction against the slave's treatment by the nobles. The primary concept of noble morality is good. The primary concept of slave morality is evil. Noble morality, this primary concept of noble morality, good, arises from the nobles saying yes to themselves, affirming themselves and their own characteristics, their strength, their power, and so on. And since it arises from a saying yes to strength and power and so on, saying yes to their drives and instincts, it is a saying yes to the will to power. It is a saying yes to life. In saying yes to themselves, the nobles are saying yes to life. And so noble morality is life affirming. Slave morality, by contrast, arises from a saying no to the nobles, saying no to their actions and what they stand for. And if the nobles are these kind of chief expressions of life, slave morality, in saying no to them, is saying no to life. It's saying no to power and strength. It's saying no to one's instincts and drives, right? And so slave morality is life denying because it says no to those characteristics of life. In noble morality, ressentiment is discharged. It doesn't build up and fester. The nobles still would feel ressentiment whenever they've been pained by somebody else. Um, but they are able to avail themselves of the true reaction. They're able to take revenge, and so this ressentiment is discharged and doesn't build up. Within the slaves, however, ressentiment is never really discharged. It festers, it grows, it's never really released. And it grows creative as a result of not being able to find any kind of actual release. And its creativity results in the creation of slave morality. Its creativity is creating slave morality. And so slave morality, this saying no to the nobles, arises out of ressentiment. Both of these systems of morality have a secondary concept. The secondary concept of noble morality is bad. It's an afterthought. They see the slaves, things that aren't remarkable, things that are common, and they say, bad. The secondary concept of slave morality, good. They see the slaves, they see themselves, and they realize, well, we're not like these nobles who we're calling evil. So we must be the good ones then. Us and our characteristics, being poor and hungry and hated and disrespected and common and vulgar, that must be good, right? And so that's how slave morality works. So in many ways, these two systems of morality are inversions of each other. They're kind of mere opposites. And we've seen that now. We've also talked about the success of the slave revolt, right? So slave morality arises, but it stays fairly confined to the slaves. The ultimate aim of the slaves, however, is to manipulate or trick the nobles into adopting slave morality, into adopting a system of values which would according to which the nobles ought to deny themselves, right? The slaves want to trick the nobles into adopting this system of values where the nobles will no longer act on their power and strength and rather will try to inhibit their power and strength. And eventually the slaves are successful at this. And Nietzsche's view is that it's Christianity, Christianity being a kind of slave morality. It's with Christianity that the slaves are ultimately successful here. The slaves convince, manipulate, whatever, the nobles to adopt Christianity. And what Nietzsche has in mind here is the kind of actual history of Christianity. Christianity starts off as a kind of sect of Judaism. And so, it's initially, at least within the first century, it's just another kind of branch of Judaism. It's nothing particularly world historical or anything like that. But it picks up steam. And by the 300s, I can't remember the exact year, but sometime in the 300s, the emperor of the Roman Empire, Constantine, converts the empire to Christianity. And Christianity spreads across the world. And in Nietzsche's view, this spread across the world and kind of simultaneous erasure of noble morality, that's the success of the slave revolt. And in Nietzsche's view, the slave revolt has been remarkably successful, so successful that we don't even realize how, the success it's enjoyed. Because everyone has adopted slave morality. Noble morality has been almost entirely eradicated. And it's only because we now have these archaeological and philological disciplines that we can look back into the past and realize that things haven't always been this way, that the kinds of values that we have today are not the kinds of values that people have always had, right? Nietzsche's in a particularly privileged position to see something like this because he's a trained academic philologist. And so he can look back into these documents from 3,000 years ago, and he can see, man, these people were very different. They didn't have any of the values that we have. They thought lying was, if anything, good. They thought they didn't care about, they didn't have these views about the sanctity of human life. They didn't think of lying or whatever, right? And things like that. They didn't try to repress their drives and instincts in the way that people today do, right? Under the influence of Christianity, this is Nietzsche's view, right? People try to repress their natural instincts and drives. Back in the day, that's not what they were doing, right? And so, with the advent of kind of philological, archaeological, anthropological investigation, inquiry, we're able to see these things. And so Nietzsche is able to see that actually we're living in this period of time, or this is the way he thinks about it. We're living in this period of time during which slave morality has enjoyed remarkable success from the mid 4th century with Constantine's converting of the Roman Empire to Christianity to today. Slave morality has reigned supreme. That's Nietzsche's view. But what he notes, and now we're going beyond the genealogy of morality, and we're going to start weaving back in the stuff we'd seen initially from the gay science and Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche was talking about the death of God. What seems to be looming on the horizon, according to Nietzsche, is nihilism. Because slave morality is falling apart. This is where this idea of God is dead comes from. God is dead and we killed him. God, as we're going to see when we turn to the third essay in more detail, God was central and in particular, this kind of um, Abrahamic God. So the kind of God that you see presented in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. That God, that figure was central to slave morality, was at the very core of slave morality. And we'll see how, like I said, when we get to the third essay. But God is dead and we killed him. And so this very central focal belief of slave morality, upon which all kinds of other beliefs of slave morality, including the values, the moral values, the value of honesty, for example, all these other values rested upon that belief in God, according to Nietzsche. Now that God is dead, what seems to be on the horizon is the dissolution of slave morality. It seems to be collapsing. Nietzsche calls, think of it. So slave morality is collapsing. Noble morality has already been eradicated. Noble morality is gone. The only system of values that people have is slave morality, and that's collapsing. And so what seems to be on the horizon? Well, a period of time in which people don't have any values. A period of time in which there is no system or table of values. That's what Nietzsche calls nihilism. Nihilism is the state of humanity in which human beings don't have any significant values or goals. Now, you may have heard that word nihilism before. And you may think of nihilism as something kind of scary, right? It's people who don't believe in anything. And so anything goes for them. And so they might just, cut your throat for $1, or they might not, or whatever. They don't believe anything. And so that's not how Nietzsche thinks about it. And in Nietzsche's view, nihilism is even worse than slave morality. Nihilism is the absolute worst state that humanity could be in. It's better to have a state of slave morality with its life-denying values. It's better to be in a state like that than to be in a state of nihilism. Nihilism, according to Nietzsche, it's not this scary, like people who don't believe anything, and so, it's going to be, or anything like that. Rather, what Nietzsche has in view when he's thinking about nihilism is something he sometimes refers to as the last men. So he'll sometimes talk about the last men. That's like human beings in this state of nihilism. He calls them the last men sometimes. And his description of the last men indicates how he views nihilism. Here's what he thinks about these last men. Here's how they'll be. They will not have any great or significant goals with their life, right? They don't really have any values. They'll want to live a kind of pleasant life that's more comfortable than it is uncomfortable. They'll want to have some kind of security for their comfortable life, but really, they don't really want that much. They just kind of want a little bit of comfort, a little bit more pleasure than pain over the course of their life, and they'll be fine. They don't have any They don't think anything really amounts to much of anything. They just want to be kind of left alone. They want to be comfortable. They want, a modicum of respect from their peers, and they want comfort and they want pleasure, and they kind of want to be able to do what they want to do, but nothing great. They don't want to do anything great or amazing, or no, they just want kind of comfort. This is what Nietzsche sees on the horizon. This is the absolute worst state of humanity, according to Nietzsche. It's better if we have this view of ourselves as these creatures of God who, need to deny certain drives of our own natural drives or whatever, so that we can return to communion with God, that's a better way of living. It's life denying, according to Nietzsche, but it's not nihilism. Nihilism, another way he thinks about it, these last men in a state of nihilism don't will anything. They don't really have a will for anything. And that is even more life denying than slave morality. Even though slave morality is willing against life, it's nonetheless still willing something. It's nonetheless still valuing something. The mere fact that it wills something, that it values something, makes it more life affirming than nihilism, even though it's willing against life, because nihilism is just not to will anything, right? And nihilism is what he sees creeping up all around him. And it's basically what we were talking about with this idea that God is dead, right? We've lost this standard by which we would make sense of our lives. We've lost the thing that would really give sense and purpose and direction to our lives, that we would will to live a particular kind of life. And so now we're just left as last men, wanting a little bit more comfort than pain, and that's about it. Nothing great, nothing remarkable, right? That's Nietzsche's view. That seems to be beckoning, or seems to be on the horizon here. And in Nietzsche's view, one of the worst things about slave morality, right? It's life denying. So that's not good. So it's bad. But really, the kind of worst thing about it is that it's kind of baked into slave morality that it's going to collapse under its own weight. And we'll see this in the third essay, why he thinks this. And so lead to nihilism. One of the worst things about slave morality, perhaps the worst thing about it, is that it seems to inevitably lead to nihilism, right? That's Nietzsche's view. And so that seems to be where we're headed. Now, what's Nietzsche doing then? What's he writing for? Well, Nietzsche seems to hold out hope that we might avoid nihilism, that with the collapse of slave morality, a window might be opened up for a new kind of nobility. The stress here is on both those words. Nobility, right? So something more like noble morality, because noble morality, after all, was life affirming, and so was good. But a new nobility. Nietzsche does not want to simply go back to the way that things were in Greece in 1000 BC or whatever. Well, why not? What's going to be different about this new nobility? What's going to be? Let's look at it a little bit. Nietzsche is not particularly clear about this. He doesn't write very much about it. He kind of throws out hints. And part of this is much of this is by design. Nietzsche himself doesn't think that we can really say much about this new nobility, about what it might look like. We'd have to wait for these new nobles to come around to create these values. Well, let's see what he does say. So, in the genealogy, he drops some hints as to what he's looking for, or what he's kind of thinking about for what this new nobility would look like. So, for instance, he says things like the following. Who would not find it 100 times better to fear if he could at the same time be allowed to admire, rather than not fear, but in the process no longer be able to rid himself of the disgusting sight of the failures, the stunted, the emaciated, the poisoned? There's this idea here that human beings, we'd rather have someone like a noble around, someone who we could fear, but also admire, rather than be stuck with slave morality or even worse, nihilism. With the fear of man, we have also lost the love for him, the reverence for him, the hope for him, indeed, our will to him, right? A glimpse at man nowadays makes us tired. What is contemporary nihilism if not that? We are weary of man, right? These last men running around in the nihilistic age that is quickly encroaching upon us are nothing to be feared. They just want a little comfort out of life. They're just nice, amiable, nice people. But being nice, not being frightening, right? There's no admiration. There's nothing great about these people. Wouldn't it be better if we had someone who maybe was a bit unpredictable, maybe a bit frightening, but who we could admire and reverence and have hope for? Yeah, something like that is the idea. A different kind of human being. Lastly, grant me a single glimpse into something perfect, something completely developed, happy, powerful, triumphant, from which there is still something to fear. A glimpse of a man who justifies humanity, of a complementary and redeeming stroke of luck of a man, for whose sake we can hang on to a faith in humanity. And so, what he's calling for here, what he's looking for, is a new kind of human being who isn't just out for a little bit of comfort in themselves and not looking to rock the boat very much. No, what a human being who is remarkable, who is perhaps kind of frightening, but who's powerful, triumphant, creative, developed, right? Something like that. A human being who we'd write history books about or whatever, something, right? Who creates something of lasting value and import, who justifies humanity. These are the kind of hints he drops in the genealogy of morality. What he's hinting at here is one of his more famous ideas, that its fame kind of outstrips how much Nietzsche talks about it. Nietzsche doesn't talk about it very much, but it's this figure that Nietzsche calls the Übermensch. That's who he's kind of hinting at here. Übermensch is the German, it's a German word, obviously, right? You can tell that by the umlaut there over the U. And translated the most obvious translation would be something like Superman. But you can kind of see why they wouldn't translate it that way, and then why people tend to leave it untranslated, right? Superman brings in all kinds of connotations of people and, blue tights and whatever, and that's not what Nietzsche's talking about. Another way you could translate it, Overman, this new remarkable kind of human being. Nietzsche's idea is going to be that what he's looking for is some human being or group of human beings or something who will create new values, who will be creators. And his idea is that if such a being were to come around today, someone who could usher in the new nobility, a new table of values to lead us out of this kind of nihilism that's on the horizon, humanity could rise higher than it ever was previously capable of. Right. And here's where we get Nietzsche's kind of criticism of the old nobility. Why could humanity rise higher than it was ever previously capable of? Higher than it was capable of back when noble morality reigned supreme? We can rise higher than ever before today precisely because of Christianity. Right? So Christianity, by and large, is a bad thing. Slave morality is, by and large, a bad thing because it's life denying, according to Nietzsche. But his kind of considered view of Christianity is going to be more sophisticated than that. He thinks Christianity has made human beings into an interesting animal. What does that mean? Back when he was talking about noble morality, one of the ways he described these nobles was as blonde beasts. What he has in mind, what he's referring to there, are lions. He's saying the nobles are like lions. And, kind of tying it into some of the ideas we've just seen recently, right? There's something, obviously, lions are frightful, right? You're afraid of a lion, but there's also something kind of majestic about them, awe-inspiring about them, their power and their strength and their violence, right? There's something mesmerizing about it. So they're both kind of frightening, but also awe-inspiring, right? That picks up on the what kind of Nietzsche was talking about earlier. But what I want to focus on now, right? And so these old nobles justified humanity in that way. They were well formed, completely developed. But these old nobles were also not that interesting. Lions, yeah, there's something awe-inspiring and terrifying about them, but there's not a lot going on upstairs. They're not psychologically all that interesting. They're kind of dumb, right? Lions are. The old nobles were. They're like lions. And yeah, they're terrifying and awe-inspiring, but they're also like lions insofar as their will to power is expressed merely as kind of violent strength. And yeah, that's an expression of the will to power. And okay, fine, but that's not particularly interesting. And it's not a particularly uh, uh, interesting expression of the will to power. It's a kind of brute, basic expression of the will to power. There isn't much of an inner life in a lion. There isn't much of an inner life in these old nobles. They're kind of brutes, right? And so, yeah, fine. It's a life affirming morality, but it's kind of brutish and violent. And yeah, that's life affirming, but it's not particularly interesting. And it's not a particularly elevated or high expression of life. Christianity makes human beings into an interesting animal. How? By directing our attention inward. And we're going to see more of this in the third essay. Christianity in particular, but slave morality more generally, but Christianity in particular, directs one's focus inside. And Nietzsche's particular idea here is what Christianity does is it turns, and we'll see this in the third essay, it turns ressentiment inward at ourselves. So ressentiment, kind of prior to Christianity, was always directed outward. You had this angry and hateful desire for revenge directed at other people. What Christianity does is train people to direct that ressentiment in at themselves, to have this anger and hate at themselves. This is Nietzsche's view. That's bad, according to Nietzsche, right? It's life denying in any kind of way. But what it does is it creates psychological depth. It makes human beings psychologically way more interesting. That's what he means when he says something like Christianity makes human beings into an interesting animal. It makes human beings, by directing their attention inward, it makes them psychologically way more interesting than any other animal on the planet. And because human beings have this psychological depth now because of Christianity, they are capable of higher heights than they've ever previously been capable of. Because of this psychological depth, Human beings can express the will to power in far more interesting and creative ways than ever before. The nobles were only ever able to express the will to power in these kind of brute, basic, and violent ways. But with the advent of Christianity and the creation of human beings as an interesting, psychologically complicated animal, the will to power can now be expressed in much more kind of refined, psychologically interesting ways. And so, what Nietzsche really has in mind here is kind of artistic creation, cultural creations. One of his figures that he reveres as a kind of perhaps, someone attempting to bring a new table of values, an Übermensch, a new creator of values, who is expressing the will to power in ways that the nobles could never even dream of, is Beethoven, right? This kind of artistic creation. And so, what Nietzsche is indicating here is that these higher expressions of the will to power are going to occur primarily through artistic creation. And you can see how that would be a kind of expression of the will to power. It's an imposition of form, right? That's one of his chief ways of describing life, of describing the will to power. That's what Beethoven does. Takes sound and imposes form on it in these incredibly sophisticated and interesting ways. And it's much more interesting. It's much more an expression of the will to power, of the imposition of form, than murdering a guy and taking his apples is, or whatever the old nobles would do, right? There's much more of an imposition of form, of the will to power in artistic creation. And Nietzsche's idea seems to be that where we are now capable of these kind of incredible artistic creations precisely because human beings are much more psychologically complex. And they are more psychologically complex because of Christianity. And so when he's looking for this Übermensch, this figure, he's looking for figures like Beethoven, who will be creators of new values in Nietzsche's view, and who through artistic creations will express the will to power in higher and purer ways than humans have ever done previously. Now, one last thing to be clear about. This Übermensch is not going to be a nihilist. Nietzsche thinks nihilism is the worst thing that there is. What he's hoping for, what Nietzsche's trying to pave the way for, this Übermensch here, is not nihilism, but rather a new nobility. And so at the very end of this first essay, what he says, he is operating beyond good and evil. He's hoping for something beyond good and evil. And what that means, beyond slave morality. We need to get beyond slave morality. But beyond good and evil does not mean beyond good and bad. And so we need to put slave morality in our past, but that doesn't mean we put all values in our past. No, I mean, that would be nihilism. What we really want is a new good and bad table of values, a new nobility. And so we can kind of fill in some of these details. This new nobility. So Nietzsche himself says he is not the bringer of the new nobility. Nietzsche sees himself as writing, during his own time, kind of between the success of the slave revolt and nihilism. So it's on the verge of nihilism. Nihilism hasn't fully taken over, but it's fast approaching. And he sees himself as trying to prepare the way for the Übermensch, for this new nobility. He's trying to prepare a path for them. Something like that is how he views his own project. So he doesn't view his own project as being part of the new nobility, as ushering in this new table of values. He's simply trying to prepare the path. So we know that this new nobility, it's going to be ushered in by an Übermensch, which is going to be this creator then of a good versus bad table of values, right? And so it's going to be a life affirming table of values. And so Nietzsche's view is that while slave morality is collapsing and so nihilism is looming, he holds out hope that we might avoid nihilism by having a Ubermensch type figure step into the void created by the collapse of slave morality and instill a new table of values, a good versus bad table of values.